I'm live right now. Hey, Evan, are you there?
Yep.
Okay, so welcome again to the Inheritance of Europe podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Boyd Richardson, and this is this podcast will cover the years 1948 to 1973. We're mostly going to be talking about Western Europe and Eastern Europe as they vie for geopolitical supremacy and economic power during the Cold War years, at least the earlier ones. I want to hand off the show to my co-host, Evan Loganov. Evan? Evan, are you there?
The last one.
Evan, can you?
We talked. Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so in the last one, we talked about the Greek Civil War that was at the end of the beginning.
Evan, you gotta stay close to your microphone. You're cutting out, man.
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. You have to get close to your microphone though, because you're cutting out.
Because I don't know. I can try doing the microphone settings. Just restarted, okay? Mine's direction.
All right. Yeah, I can just shave off the first couple minutes. Yeah, but just make sure your microphone's operational.
Can you hear me, Coach?
No, you're cutting out again, man. Not sure why.
Because this is a computer. Like I can try doing it on my phone.
Yeah, do it on your phone. I think that's what you usually do anyway. All right, we're still live, but I can just shave off the first couple minutes.
Okay, you should just restart it because it's not going to be.
Yeah. Hi, hello, welcome to the Inheritance of Europe podcast. This is our installment on the Cold War, or at least the early part of it, and it covers the years 1948 to 1973. This period spans an era of psychological warfare, economic warfare, and some proxy wars in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. A lot of colonial powers will be dismantled in North Africa, and a lot of freedoms and civil liberties will start to emerge in Western Europe, and also even a little bit in Eastern Europe. So, without any further ado, I will hand off the podcast to my co-host Evan Loganov. Evan.
Okay. So, in the last one, we talked about the Greek Civil War to kind of end off the World War II era thing, and that was kind of one of the people considered the first real conflict of the Cold War. But one of the things that was really kind of the first conflict involving the Soviet, and that actually played a key role in the creation of NATO. First of all, Greek and Turkey were considered kind of like the places where the Soviet Union would push forward first, and they kind of made the alliance of NATO, and the Soviets responded with the Warsaw Pact in their own era. One of the first real confrontations was in the form of the Berlin blockade. So, as many people know, Germany was split up into East and West Germany after the Yalta Conference, and the deal with them making about the division of the lands, the West being occupied and then later becoming independent with the Western powers, and East Germany being aligned with the Soviets. But there was a part of East Germany. It wasn't part of in Berlin. It wasn't really part of West Germany officially, but it was more aligned sociopolitically because that was where the French and British were occupied territories in West Berlin. And late, the Allies made the former sort of Western powers made a move to have the Deutschmark, the West German Deutschmark, introduced into West Berlin to kind of integrate it in with the kind of West Germany and the other powers. And the Soviets saw this as a provocation and trying to move into their sphere of influence. So what they did was they engaged in a blockade economically around West Berlin, and said they'd only lift it if the Western powers withdrew their plans to introduce the Deutschmark. And what happened was there was a massive airlift, actually, with the Allies, with Britain, the UK, and France, lifting in supplies into West Berlin to kind of break the blockade by plane. It was kind of an amazing feat, but it ultimately worked, and it ended without bloodshed. There was still a major confrontation, like one of the first between the Soviets and the Western powers in that era.
Yeah, and the military blockade around Berlin was odd, because at that point Berlin wasn't even the principal capital of the of Western Germany. That would be their capital was in Bonn, and not only that, but the Reichsmark had been changing, for several decades. It was the Deutschmark. Originally, it was the Reichsmark, and then it turned into the Deutschmarks, and then it turns into this new Soviet currency. And so the resistance to this change is very telling about the attitudes that the German people had under new authoritarian dictatorship under Stalin. The Stasi would actually come to be a very important force in basically a sort of a secret police. They would repress a lot of East Germans in order to they basically were a watered down version of the SS. Also, it's important to remember that the southern part of Germany, southeastern part of Germany, was actually still part of Western Europe, liberal democracies, so on, as was Austria. It was only the northeastern quadrant of the modern country, Germany, that was considered Eastern Germany. And these airlifts didn't last for a long time. Eventually, the Berlin Wall ended up being built. But a lot of people don't know that the Berlin Wall was only built in the early 60s. So what else is on the roster, Evan?
Well, we could talk about in the kind of the Western powers, the UK had a series of nationalization that was done in their country under the Labour government then. It was kind of pushed forward. It was popular among the labor unions that had kind of sort of brought them into power, but eventually it became to be considered like a big failure, and even the big supporters like labor unions agreed that it hadn't gone as it was planned. They said it hadn't really brought the workers any real betterment. It was just basically changing the private bosses for the government bosses. They're often even the same people that were in charge, but it does kind of signal a shift. It was probably the most socialistic that Britain had gotten in its history, even without just being a full out just socialist or planned economy, though.
Yeah, the UK had been going through steady periods of modernization, liberalization, and socialization even. A lot of people forget that there was a figure called Oswald Mosley, who was basically the Nazi party leader in Britain before World War II. And that sort of radical nationalization movement persisted into in an altered form, even after the war. Whether or not the consequences are as notable as having a Nazi party leader running around is another question entirely. What's also important to talk about is what's going on in Ireland at this time, because basically the troubles that we know of that ended in the 1990s, those were really kicking into shape, and they would persist for basically half a century. Earlier, they had some in the interwar period in the 30s. There was a military police invasion called the Black and Tans that stood to suppress the Republic of Ireland from taking over Northern Ireland. But those guys were kind of long gone, and now there was all out guerrilla warfare in urban centers, many of whom were directing themselves towards Belfast, which was Protestant majority place, although it did have some Catholics who were insurrectionists there. So Ireland's not in great shape, even though they didn't participate in World War II, and even though they are officially neutral in the conflict. What else? What else did you want to talk about, Evan?
Well, yeah, we got to the Troubles. The biggest sort of events of the heating up of the Troubles didn't really start until the 60s. But before then, it was basically a system of they talk about apartheid in South Africa. It was basically a system of apartheid between the Protestants in Northern Ireland and the Catholics. There was a significant minority, but a minority nonetheless. and the Protestants pretty much dominated all the institutions and like really discriminated against Catholics, you know. But other than that,
the Catholic Church had this reputation for being a religion of fear, a religion that was, unsophisticated. This dichotomy between Protestant Christians and Catholic Christians is nothing new, but at the time it was sort of this was the main event going on in unfortunately in Irish society.
Okay, so another thing I want to get into is like the kind of the era of the last sort of Stalinist era post World War II. So kind of like Hitler near the end of his life, Stalin became a little crazy too, kind of like really delusional. I mean, he'd always been somewhat, but even more so then. Some significant events were, there was this doctor, the biologist named Lysenko, I forget his first name, but he basically had this idea that one plant could change into another plant by just altering it during their lifestyle, and then Stalin actually endorsed it, and then all biologists had to follow Lysenkoism, or they'd be dismissed or jailed or killed. And basically this at least partially caused a famine in the Soviet Union, that like one of the last sort of famines of the Stalinist era.
Yeah, and keep in mind that in the 30s, Ukraine was starved almost as a form of genocide. I mean, an unofficial form of genocide. And so the Soviet Union has a legacy at this point of not using science to help its people in the best way, especially under Stalin. Probably even more to the point, only under Stalin. At this point, Stalin is also grown very distrustful of his most important national heroes and icons and political figures. I know you're going to talk more about that. I just wanted to mention George Zhukov, who was basically the George Washington of World War II for the Russians, and he could have been in high political office or run the entire army because of what he accomplished in the World War. But Stalin was afraid of him because he had so much cultural significance and fame that he basically exiled him to work as a lowly general in the Ural mountain range because he didn't want him anywhere near Moscow. You're gonna talk about Molotov and Beria and Khrushchev. So I'll let you go for that.
Before that, I was going to talk about there was also the thing called the Doctors' Plot, which was basically a group of all Jewish doctors were arrested on trumped-up charges of trying to poison Stalin. Like Stalin kind of became more overtly, anti-Semitic during the end of his, reign, basically. And there's also the Night of the Murdered Poets, campaigns against rootless cosmopolitans. But when he died, that was the kind of thing where Stalin had been such a dominant figure that there was a huge power struggle again. Some of them were Molotov, Khrushchev, and Beria. Now,
before you jump into that, we should clarify that a lot of these figures that were persecuted were basically just sent to the gulag or sent to a prison somewhere because they weren't always necessarily murdered in the streets, but they were usually imprisoned for a long period of time because their dissident voice was considered a threat to Stalin. And these persecutions were behind the Iron Curtain. So in the West, no one really knew or cared to know or was able to find out that they were going on. Yeah, anyway, go on.
Yeah. So, and then Beria was going to get into, he was considered they quoted him as Stalin's Himmler. And basically, he was the right-hand man. He was the head of the NKVD, which was kind of like the secret police, the sort of security service there. And he was involved in a lot of the kind of most brutal aspects of the Stalinist regime. He organized mass deportations, the Gulag system. He, kind of just ran like the kind of political persecution campaigns against kulaks and others. He was a key and involved in the kind of execution of their strategy in World War II. One of the things he did was he rounded up a bunch of Polish intelligentsia and military officers, brought them back to Russia, and just mass executed them in an event called the Katyn Forest Massacre. But he was considered one of the top people to replace Stalin. But ultimately, he was outmaneuvered and by Khrushchev and a bunch of the others, and he was actually, they executed him. They didn't want to keep him around. He was just taken out and killed, sentenced for supposed crimes. So when Khrushchev came into power,
wasn't it? It was actually Zhukov himself who famously was brought back to Moscow after Stalin died just to arrest Beria, because Beria was such a high-ranked official that you need someone like Zhukov to actually have the muscle to do that. And I believe he physically arrested him and kind of threw him to the wall, handcuffed him, made a show of force. But it was only a couple hours later that Barrier was kind of thrown into the street and shot to death because he was a horrendous rapist.
Yeah, and then Khrushchev came out. He said, obviously the Soviet Union was still a dictatorship, but they call it the Khrushchev thaw, where sort of the worst excesses of the Stalinist regime were toned down. There was actually a speech in 1956 he gave in front of the Politburo, which is like the Soviet government, sort of denouncing Stalinist crimes. This was viewed as a big shock, especially to what would be considered Western leftists, because they had previously sort of seen the Soviet Union as like a model, like kind of, as a civilization beyond capitalism, and they kind of dismissed the allegations of this sort of atrocities as just propaganda. But it's a bit harder to do when you have like the very head of the Soviet authorities basically saying, yeah, this all happened, it was wrong.
Yeah, and of course Nikita Khrushchev was considered to be pretty competent and favored over Stalin by many. The only thing is that eventually he didn't have the longest tenure as the general secretary, and eventually when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, it shined a disfavorable light on him, and he was quickly succeeded after that by Brezhnev.
Okay, so we should get into like decolonization now about like
Yeah, okay. Just as a brief overview, you have the English and French. Italy as principal colonizers, right? Italy for hundreds of years they've been doing this. Mostly the British, but also the French in significant parts of the world. And we have other countries that have had colonies like Portugal, but that's no longer. Brazil had been independent for a long time, and that was their main colony. Also Mozambique, but that's neither here nor there. The Netherlands, they had lost most of their colonies except for some, cool islands and maybe Suriname or whatever. But the French had Vietnam, the French had Algeria, they had Syria, and they had Lebanon. And of course, the British had India, but that was after World War II under Gandhi. That was completely, gotten rid of. And the British also had Egypt briefly, but then the Egyptians kind of took hold of that as well. So without belaboring it, you wanted to talk about Vietnam, I believe.
Yeah. Well, so the British actually had like a sort of like a not as rough an end to colonization. A lot of the decolonization was more peaceful and just kind of very kind of just fluid with the British. They didn't have any major conflicts. They had some, like the Mau Mau rebellions in Kenya, but overall, they didn't really try to cling on to their colonies as much as the French did. But the French did, and two of the major ones were in France. I mean, Vietnam and Algeria. So with Vietnam, you had the Viet Minh, which were the precursor to the Viet Cong under Ho Chi Minh. They were considered not explicitly communist then, but it was like a catch-all Vietnamese nationalist movement who wanted to fight against the French, to gain independence. And the French obviously did not want to acquiesce to that, so they fought a war against them. But the French people had no will to fight for something that was like thousands of miles away. And obviously the Vietnamese were a lot greater numbers, and especially after they defeated them in a battle called Dien Phu. Basically the French realized it was all but done for them, and they agreed to leave Algeria. And that was kind of the first major loss for their colonial empire. Next would be Algeria. Now, Algeria is different because Algeria was actually considered, it had department status in France, not colonial status.
Oh, by the way, we should keep in mind, what years are these?
What's the end was 1954. Algeria, this is a big conflict of the 50s with France. But Algeria had department status, which meant basically like their version of a state, which was officially a part of their country. And native Algerians demanded independence from the French, but there were also a lot of native French who were living in Algeria, sort of, and like hundreds of thousands of them. And the French actually fought, very hard to keep Algeria. First of all, it was a lot closer to them than Vietnam, and it was considered like since a lot of French lived there, it was considered part of their national pride to keep it.
It was also one of their oldest colonies, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 1830s. So that was pretty brutal. Like the tactics they used were condemned like internationally, like basically just extremely brutal scorched earth tactics against rebels. But eventually, especially, and this was kind of like a humiliation for de Gaulle, ultimately it got so bad that they had no choice. Like the so much of the country had turned against him. He had no choice but to leave. And de Gaulle was kind of very embarrassed by this because he was known as the person who refused to, kneel to Hitler, and now he was, acquiescing to independence of Algeria, kind of losing part of France. So this was kind of, a thing where, obviously the native French fled back to the country. They weren't going to stay in Algeria. But the Algerians who did help the French, the native Algerians, largely did not flee to France, and they got some pretty brutal, revenge against them by the new Algerian government. I mean, they didn't end up too well.
Yeah, that was a pretty long war of independence on the part of Algeria, and afterwards, there was this sort of a little dispute over what is the nationhood of the liberated Algerians? Are they French? Are they Algerian? And also, of course, the expatriates that immigrated to France from Algeria over the years. And they kind of came to the conclusion that there's no real, the government would sometimes be like, oh, no, they are 100% French. But the more sophisticated thinkers would be like, there's no real category for people that spent so much of their life in France but grew up speaking Arabic and had Algerian culture, or vice versa. So it's an interesting example of how North Africa sort of mingles with Southern Europe. And there's no real. Sometimes these people evade categorization, and that's part of the reason why this war took place in general. In Lebanon, and Syria also revolted against France for independence. I'm not going to go into it. I think it's basically the same sort of story. What's a little bit more interesting to me is the Suez crisis in Egypt, because in Egypt Nasser was their leader, and he nationalized the Suez Canal against the wishes of Britain or France, and
Israel.
And Israel, of course. Yeah, Israel is a new state, right? So Israel is rising in authority and influence, and so there's a series of wars that go on, basically trying to stomp out Egyptian hegemony in the region. The Israelis seize the Sinai Peninsula, and there's the 6 Days War, the Yom Kippur War. There's several small wars like this, and this isn't really like Palestine versus Israel. This is Egypt versus Israel, and basically the UN for the first time has to get involved in a very serious way and be like, no, we are deciding what goes on with the Suez Canal, and Britain and France no longer had control, and it was a benchmark a watermark really for Egyptian sovereignty and Arab independence everywhere. Did you talk about Vietnam yet? I think you probably should.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, you did? Okay.
With the Suez crisis, the thing is, it kind of was a signifying event that Britain and France were no longer world powers, because they said the United States actually warned them ahead of time, don't do this, you won't have our backing if you do this, and then they did it, and then they had to go home tail between their legs, and they just showed kind of the U.S. was the big game in town in terms of Western powers than Britain and France.
Yeah. So you're saying the U.S. had to who had to tell? Was it Eisenhower? Yeah. Eisenhower had established something called the Eisenhower Doctrine, which was his view that the Soviet Union had to be sort of scared by. It's a little bit unintuitive, but basically Eisenhower would send resources to North African countries that were liberated or decolonized, and he would try to get them on his good side, America, so that the Soviet Union couldn't influence them in turn against the West, and it was pretty effective. The one country that this is most famous with, even more than Egypt for the Suez crisis, is Turkey, which a lot of people don't know, by the way. Turkey had a revolution in 1960 that where they had a military dictatorship, and then basically that kind of eroded over not that long of a time, and then the Republican values of Turkey basically took hold in their modern form, more or less. I mean, up until Erdogan. I don't really know what's going on with Erdogan right now, but for a long time, that was sort of the beginning of what we think of as modern Turkey. And the American military and diplomacy put nuclear warheads in in Turkey, right away under in the Black Sea, as a threat to Russia, or just as a safeguarding from Russia, the Soviet Union, right? But then the Soviet Union, in retaliation, they wanted to put their missiles in Cuba. And of course, Cuba was, you know more about this than I do, but I can say that Fidel Castro did not decide immediately that he wanted to be communist, but he was in a position where he didn't really trust the U.S. after he took over from Batista and took over Cuba. He didn't really trust the U.S., so he just sort of ran into communism as like, hey, we'll be communist.
Well, the thing is, he nationalized American property, which pretty much was a sure sign that America was going to be against him and try to depose him. So he needed allies.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's how most alliances form. But this is the thing, and so Turkey is an example of the Eisenhower Doctrine at its fullest. What did you want to talk about next? Did you have anything?
Okay. Well, first of all, I got to talk about the Hungary uprising. That was a big thing.
1957, the Budapest Uprising. Yeah.
So basically, there was a kind of thing where originally the Eastern European nations, the Soviets, were kind of viewed as liberators from Nazi oppression, and they were willing to tolerate them for a certain time because of that. But eventually, when they kind of set up their puppet governments that were increasingly authoritarian, increasingly, controlling of their populations, a lot of them started to grow discontent. In 1953, there was like a sort of small protest movement in East Germany that was crushed. But the biggest sort of uprising in terms of the 50s would be in Hungary. Now, this had to do with there were a bunch of students who the kind of fever against the Soviet Union had been building for a while. But the thing is, there were a lot of students who went to the Hungarian parliament to give them a list of demands, basically for greater liberalization of the society. And the kind of 16 demands, and they were ultimately detained by security guards, basically brought in, and then there was a bunch of protesters outside who basically demanded their release, saying you should release them. And then the AVH, which was the state security authority, kind of opened fire. A bunch of protesters and killed some, sort of like a Boston Massacre sort of thing. But after that, there was a widespread, sort of revolutionary militias were formed. Basically kind of Soviet authorities were deposed all around the country. Then there was this guy named Imre Nagy who basically got control over the Communist Party there and declared that it was going to separate from the Warsaw Pact and basically establish a liberal democracy, more or less. And this ultimately what led to the Soviet army invading. And there was sort of bloody street battles, basically against the Soviet authorities. The Molotov cocktail kind of got its name from then. That's the Molotov, state security guy. Basically, they throw the cocktails at the Soviet, tanks and stuff like that. But ultimately, they didn't stand a chance against the sort of Soviet superior weapons. And they've ultimately basically, we took control of the country. They got Nagy and basically executed him summarily. And then that was kind of the signal that they wouldn't, tolerate any dissent among their client states or independence, really.
Yeah, it was a sign that the Soviet Union was here to stay, and on the flip side, it was a sign that the people underneath the Soviet control didn't want to have to deal with it all the time. And there was a lot of violence that happened. But before this even happened, there was a lot of Yugoslavia had a little bit more independence from the Soviet Union than Hungary did. And Joseph Tito did not really like Joseph Stalin, but he also didn't really sort of like Castro. He didn't really like, the West either. He didn't really like Stalin or the West. So he kind of found a way to forge a third path for himself, but he was still nominally communist and still mostly in the Soviet direction, but just not as much as the other democratic Soviet countries. Yeah. Soviet democracy, Soviet republics, right?
In terms of the Soviet Union, you have to get into the launch of Sputnik. You want to talk about that, or?
Well, there's a Sputnik 1 and 2, and it was they had the first a satellite launched, and then they also had Vostok projects where they had the first astronaut circumnavigate the world from space, Yuri Gagarin. And weirdly enough, Yuri Gagarin he's the first major astronaut, bigger than Neil Armstrong probably. But weirdly enough, he dies in the late 60s in a plane crash that was part of a military test. And no one to this day can really figure out what happened, because it's really unusual for planes to just crash, especially jets. They're powered by like really, competent military pilots. So there's a lot of rumors that there was foul play, and even there's rumors that even the Soviet leadership wanted to kill him because he was too famous. And that's Yuri Gagarin, the first legit astronaut. Really, it's amazing. The first guy to go into space and look around and see the world at all its angles. Kind of crazy.
Well, it's kind of another thing is that the Soviet Sputnik, along with the atomic project, was helped by a lot of German scientists who were taken to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's right. There's a brain drain on both sides. In America, they had the Werner von Braun, who ran NASA, and he was a Nazi sort of business magnate. But he became a manufacturing guy, but he was famous for murdering the Jews who worked in his factory, who worked the slowest, and you'd have them hung. And he was but they didn't care in NASA. They made him the fucking. It's kind of a messed up story. But in the East, they had a lot of innumerable German scientists as well. And Germany actually has a strong tradition of cooperating with the Soviet Union, and because of Eastern Germany. Let's not forget.
Well, yeah, another thing, late 50s was what's significant. In 1959 was the establishment of the European Economic Community, which is considered the precursor to the European Union. It was basically, it developed out of the European Coal and Steel Community. It was kind of what was considered a customs union or free trade zone between Europe.
They also developed the international court system and under the Geneva Convention, and they developed the United Nations offices assembled. Yeah, so a lot of things were going on before the European Union or the Eurozone or the Schengen area, all that even existed. The Euro, none of that existed.
Well, yeah, but it was considered kind of one of the first signs. They thought that they could avoid a World War II if they had some sort of economic integration that would help them, avoid that again within Western Europe. But when we get into the 60s, I mean, obviously, the 60s, it was kind of considered like with the European recovery economically. In America, the 50s was considered kind of an era of economic boom. But the economic boom, largely because Europe was devastated by World War II, didn't really reach Western Europe until the 60s. And that was kind of a thing where it's considered, and then like obviously in the 70s, it would get like a lot worse with the oil crisis. But that was considered kind of an economic golden age and cultural golden age in Europe.
Yeah. You're talking. Sorry. What did you call the golden age?
The 60s.
The 60s were the beginning of sort of this postmodern reality we live in. It was really the death blow of the modern landscape in terms of ideology, and not just culturally, but also societally as well. In Britain, you had famous free love movements and also there's this renewed interest in Indian culture because India was now a sovereign nation. It had more status in the global community, and so because of that, what people mistook as Indian sort of cultural tropes were readopted in the West, and that's all the free love, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the beads in the doors, the tie-dye, the peace signs, Near East symbolism and all of that, poetry, marijuana. It's all there.
Oh, yeah. It was called the swinging 60s in the UK.
The swinging 60s, yeah, which is actually an allusion to an earlier era in America which was the swing era.
I considered like the 20s, but there's also like religious liberalization. People are playing more secular, and even
keep in mind though, in France and in Italy and Spain, they weren't really involved in the whole free love thing. It was more of a decidedly Anglophonic sort of affair.
Yeah,
and actually, Italy had a very tough. Greece had a very tough stagflation later on, but before that, Italy had really bad economic troubles, and known as the years of lead, and
that was the 70s,
but that was basically was that really early 70s or late 70s?
It started in the late 60s and went to the 80s, especially kind of political turmoil. We can talk more about like the specific.
So it happened in the 60s, so it's all good. And the other thing is that the Spain was still under Franco's rule, who was their fascist dictator from the the Spanish Civil War. So this idea that freedom was sort of not as taken for granted as it is now back then, considering that you had a fascist dictator across the border or across the channel or whatever. And the other thing is that Italy had a king that was sort of its constitutional monarch. And Spain still does. A lot of people don't know that, King Philippe. But Italy actually had a king until the early 80s. So there's a lot of patrimonial sort of rules still going on in a weird reduced form in Europe.
Yeah, even like within terms of like societal liberalization, this even reached institutions like the Catholic Church, which have been among the most.
Vatican II was this famous liberalizing council that had views on abortion and views on. You can go for it if you want.
Well, they kept the views on abortion up, so that's still going on. But specifically with regards to like
they commented on it though. But
yeah. They said previously that services could only be held in traditional Latin and not in vernacular language. They kind of took away that requirement and said that the services can now be held in vernacular languages. They also denounced like kind of overt anti-Semitism, namely the idea that Jews were responsible for Jesus' death. They said that, religious toleration and freedom can be, reconciled with Catholicism and not just like, it wasn't, just like a value that was like worldly and like sort of liberal, but it could actually be within Catholicism. So ultimately there was a lot of liberals, even institutions that were as intransigent and kind of stuck in the past. The Catholic Church realized they had to liberalize at that time.
Yeah, and also we don't talk enough about the Greek Orthodox Church and the reforms they went through under the Ottomans, and after they became more and more of a culturally relevant institution in Greece than ever before. And eventually, eventually that would subside, and Greece would actually become less dependent on religion. It's just all the same. The one thing that's interesting about Greece during this period is that there is the rise of a business mogul, known as Aristotle Onassis, and he produced one of the most profitable freight trading shipping companies in the world. And still today, Greece has a reputation and a large sector of its industry devoted to shipping.
And obviously, this is the time we have like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the so-called.
Well, that's stupid because that's you also
but that's just like a thing. Like they show basically like the Beatles. What a lot of people don't know is they moved to the U.S. because of high tax rates in Britain, not necessarily like because they just loved America.
Yeah, but there's a lot of bands that are worth mentioning that aren't the Beatles. I mean, you have Pink Floyd, you have Led Zeppelin, you have Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, all British. All worth mentioning. And in France, they weren't crazy about the Beatles until after the Beatles broke up. And then they started kind of slowly getting into it. The French still likes sort of this old style crooning, with Jacques Brel or even Edith Piaf to an extent. They had a very famous Elvis-like figure in France known as, not Jacques Bardin, but what's his, Serge Gainsbourg, who was sort of this alcoholic, degenerate guy who was popular in France for a long, long time until he killed himself by accident. The cultures are very different, and Scandinavia too. I mean, Scandinavia is obviously more Germanic than France, like England, but they're not all they're all the same. And Scandinavia, though, at this time was known for its socializing policies, its reform policies, its progressive movements, and let's not forget to mention, in case we forgot, that Greenland and the Faroe Islands are part of Denmark. So Denmark looks small, but it actually has all of Greenland basically under its belt.
Yeah. I think we touched upon it earlier, but we'll get into like the idea of the creation of the Berlin Wall, which was actually created in the early 60s.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, okay. The thing about the Berlin Wall, you always say most of it, but I just wanted to say about the Berlin Wall was that there were a lot of efforts. It was a very dark time because because people in Berlin had this tremendously horrifying wall there, and you would be severely punished if you tried to jump over it one way or the other. And a lot of people would try to make light of it, but the fact of the matter stood that it was just doom and gloom because Berlin was still stuck in Eastern Germany, and it was not connected by road to Western Germany, Western Europe. And so the music that came out of Berlin and the paintings and the design work, the architecture and all that was very brutalist and very sort of despondent and bleak. But it affected the 20th century in an amazing way. You get Bauhaus, you get the design school, in Germany. You get the Frankfurt School, this intellectual stuff. These things all sort of were reacting to what was going on in Berlin. And that's not to mention stuff that happened past the year 1973. Many things, because the Berlin Wall didn't fall until 1989.
Yeah, so I was going to say is basically the ostensible purpose was, they say it was called the Anti-Fascist Barrier, basically, in Germany. It said the purpose was to keep, fascist elements from West Berlin from coming into East Berlin. But I think anyone with a brain can know the real reason is they wanted to keep a brain drain from happening from their country, because people would flee into West Berlin, into West Germany. And that was causing a lot of their most, sort of talented, entrepreneurial, or what you could call entrepreneurial people to leave West Germany. There's a huge population drain, so they built the wall to keep them trapped in, because they could easier, because they could just go to West Berlin and then go to West Germany. But ultimately, they had there was they don't know the exact number, but somewhere around 200 people officially died, trying to cross the wall. They actually have a memorial plaque to them on the site today. But ultimately, it was considered sort of a dark symbol, though.
Yeah, those numbers seem a little bit diminished to me, but who knows? And the other thing is, you wanted to talk also about the May rebellion in France?
First of all, I have to get into the Irish troubles, just touch on that for a sec. So, in the mid-'60s, like I said, about the kind of sort of apartheid-style system in Northern Ireland, there was a movement partially inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States of Catholics who...
Okay, before you do that, though, because we talked about that already, let's talk...
No, but I just want to go into the beginning of the trouble.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Before you do, let's talk about the Prague Spring, because...
Okay, first of all, I wanted to talk about 1968. So, people know about 1968 within the United States, things like the King assassination, the sort of anti-Vietnam War movement reaching its apex, Bobby Kennedy assassination, the 68 election, just this time of social turmoil. But that was also true in Europe. There were large student movements in Italy, Germany, and in Poland across the Eastern Bloc that were against the sort of established governments and systems there. But the two biggest events, both on the East and West Europe on the Iron Curtain, were in France and in Czechoslovakia. I'll touch on France first, and then I'll let you talk about this. So, France was considered kind of more traditional, what you'd call sort of student rebelliousness against the establishment. They were basically student movements within Paris, and what their main demand was, they had a lot of sort of, traditional leftist, concerns like free love against, materialism and stuff like that. One of their main organizing demands was that the universities would control their personal lives so much, like not allowing them to have people of the opposite sex around the same room, and basically putting all these stringent controls on them. And they would organize demonstrations against it. And as you can imagine, a lot of them got rowdy, and basically a lot of times they set up barriers basically and took control of the parts of the streets. And there's one instance where the French authorities in Paris sent the police in full riot gear, basically tear gas, truncheons. And as you can imagine, basically they beat the living crap out of the students. And it was considered just so disproportionate that it caused outrage among the trade unions, who then organized what's called a sympathy strike with the students, basically. And this ended up devolving into such a mass event of occupations at different workplaces and just government buildings across France. It was something like some crazy amount, like a quarter of the French workforce took part in this. And they're basically, it didn't have any real central aim to it, other than just general anti-establishment feelings. But ultimately got so bad that de Gaulle had to leave the country because he feared for his safety. And basically, ultimately they did get it under control. But it was just considered a very notable event in terms of just how spontaneously it arose, and basically just how drastic it affected the country in a short period of time. It's called May '68, and it's still known in terms of street art in France and as an anti-establishment sort of symbol.
One thing that it's interesting you brought this up about de Gaulle is that famously Winston Churchill also tried to get back into power, and Clement, what's his name? Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee, yeah, and he won the popular vote and was elected, and Churchill had to actually go back and at the next term and win. But so this, and it just goes to show that Churchill and de Gaulle were not, these military leaders like Napoleon. They were politicians that were whose careers existed on the whims of the fucking populace.
Yeah. And do you want to talk about the Prague Spring?
Yeah, the Prague Spring was really just a sort of sexed up version of the Budapest Uprising. A lot of violence in Czechoslovakia, a lot of clamoring for reform, a softening of Soviet policy. There's a guy called Alexander Dugin. What's his name? Chukin?
Yeah,
Dubček. Yeah, Alexander Dubček, and he was sort of the face and brains behind this spring, where they're trying to create a communism with a human face, as they called it. The reality was that the Soviets weren't going to let that happen. But 19 years later, it basically did with the glasnost and perestroika policies, with the dismantling of the USSR. So it was just a matter of time. And it took the form of the Prague Spring more than it did the Budapest Uprising. So the Prague Spring was a little bit more of a prophecy than it was a strong rebellion, although there were cases of people burning themselves alive in order to, it's almost like Nepal or something, or they're trying to signal freedom, I guess.
Well, yeah, but like this,
and the one major result that happened, there were several policies that were enacted and eventually slowly eroded, quickly taken away, but they did have some lasting policy changes with the Prague Spring. And one of them was that, and this has lasted till today, is that the Czech Republic would be separated forever from Slovakia. And so you had the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. And so that's still true today. It might not be true. Maybe the Austro-Hungarian Empire will step back in and take over. But as far as we know, that's going to stay.
Well, yeah, it's kind of different with the Prague Spring. Like with Hungary as a fallen rebellion, with the Prague Spring, it was just like a reform movement that was repressed. It just shows how the Soviets wouldn't tolerate, any sort of dissent from the party.
Yeah. The Prague Spring was actually like a top-down movement, more to an extent, whereas the Budapest Uprising was a bottom-up.
And Dubček wasn't like executed in prison; he was just relieved of his duties.
Yeah, that's important to remember. Yeah,
he was assigned like an ambassadorship that would have relative little control. But I'll get back into the Troubles, like I was talking about earlier. So the Troubles, you had Irish Catholics starting the civil rights movement, where they engaged in demonstrations inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States, mainly. And then there was ultimately what were called Unionists, mostly Protestant or virtually all Protestant, who accused the civil rights movement of being a Republican plot, meaning a plot to have Northern Ireland join Ireland and break away from the UK. And ultimately, there was a lot of violence inflicted mostly by the Protestant Unionists and the Royal Ulster Constabulary against the civil rights marchers. And this was around the time the IRA was formed. Now, the IRA did have explicit, Republican aims of breaking Northern Ireland away from the UK, and they started as a movement then, of course, the Provisional IRA. But ultimately, the British came in originally as a peacekeeping, force. Kind of just their stated purpose was not to take a side in this conflict, just to prevent violence between the two. But ultimately, there was an event called Bloody Sunday in 1972, where the British opened fire on a bunch of Republican demonstrators in a town called Derry, which is in Northern Ireland. It was called Londonderry Derry. It's kind of a dispute between Unionists and the Republicans. But ultimately, after that point, the British began to be seen more as on the side of the Unionists than among the sort of the Republicans or the civil rights marchers. And this was a point where a lot of violence started erupting, especially from the IRA, who would conduct terrorist attacks on the police, Protestants and the British troops, basically. So this was just a time of just general violence.
And that lasted until officially it ended in the late 90s. But it was going on the same time as Kosovo and Herzegovina and stuff. And so it's a very interesting sort of fringe military activity between these warring factions. I think a lot of people overlook or just even. I mean, I had a lot of Irish family going back generations, but like I don't think about the Troubles. It's not like something that's like my mind is preoccupied with because I have Irish lineage or whatever from Irish descent.
Well, yeah, it's relatively recent.
It's relatively recent, yeah, but it also doesn't. I'm not like fracked with. So I'm just saying it's like it's interesting how it's this fringe kind of phenomenon that doesn't really even Irish Americans don't even think about it, And the other thing is the going back to the cultural stuff, which I like to talk about because I spoil myself with it. I want to talk about media and how media is changing. I don't have to tell you that television is like in every house, but I will say is that television is replacing paintings and printed art in an unusual way. Eventually, screens will replace posters, but advertisements, billboards. But at this point, just paintings are kind of being replaced by TVs and stuff, and you're getting there's conventional sort of work that's middle of the road, but there's also French New Wave and Italian neorealism that I think are the best filmic movements in European history, with the possible exception of a Soviet sort of science fiction work at the time. If you ever see the movie Solaris, it's based off a story by Stanislaw Lem, and it's a great movie that's sort of Soviet science fiction. It's not, there's no action in it, but it kind of represents sort of that, but maybe not entirely, but largely represents a sort of a Soviet ethos on dystopian science fiction. Very beautiful film.
Well, yeah.
Anyway, what else did you want to talk about, Evan?
Well, also, I should mention that this is around the time that the Italian car industry came into being as the post-World War II era, like that we know of today.
Oh, yeah, Lamborghini was made tractors, and then he converted, went away from that. Ferrari didn't approve of that, and so he got jealous, and he started competing with Ferrari. And also, we get more and more cars from Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, Audi. And those are out of Stuttgart and Munich. BMW stands for Bavarian Motor Works, so that's Munich and Bavaria. But I don't know much about automobile models. I don't know what years which ones came out. I know some about American cars, but that's about it.
Volkswagen originally was an idea conceived during the Nazi time. It didn't really come into real being until after World War II.
That's also like Fanta. Did you know Fanta? I mean, it's a little bit of a tangent, but did you know Fanta is a Nazi sort of just a German drink? It was
that came around at the time.
What happened was the Americans shut down the Coca-Cola plant in Germany, and so they had to make a drink. They didn't have the supplies to make the Coca-Cola, so they ended up making Fanta just sort of as just to sell something.
Okay, so let's get into the last thing, which would be the oil crisis in 1973. So the backstory of this would be the Yom Kippur War.
Oh, so before we go into the oil crisis thing, I want to mention that there's a lot of Soviet cars that had a bad reputation in the West, but looking back, they actually performed quite well. And in the Soviet Union, they would have been considered very good and luxurious. And another thing about the Soviet economy is that they had a lot of convenience stores and a lot of supermarkets in the Soviet Union, and a lot of consumerism, despite the fact that they had a central market economy and that they didn't really allow for free trade in any sort of blatant expression.
But I think we forgot about just brief aside. They talk about Khrushchev being replaced by Brezhnev, who was more of a hardliner in the early 60s.
Yeah, Leonid Brezhnev actually was a Stalin ideologue in a way. He would ramp up the atomic hydrogen bomb production basically to an absurd extent, to the point that you could destroy the entire planet, if not the fucking sun, with the amount of atomic bombs they made.
Let's get into the last thing.
And the U.S. did too, but I think the Soviets outpaced them at some point.
Let's get into the last thing we'll cover, which is the 1973 oil crisis and recession. So the backstory of that is an event called the Yom Kippur War. which was, first of all, we'll talk about the 6-Day War, which was when Israel fought back an invasion by surrounding Arab powers and ended up taking the lands that we consider the Palestinian territories today, along with the Sinai Peninsula and a bunch of others. And obviously the Yom Kippur War was, the Arabs obviously didn't like this and, planned a war to get these back. And the Yom Kippur War was planned on the Jewish high holy day of Yom Kippur. And it was an invasion by the Arab powers. And to discuss how Europe relates to this is that, or at least Western Europe, is that Israel originally was kind of more neutral between the Soviets and the Americans, especially after the Suez crisis. It became pretty clear it would align more with the Western powers of the UK and France, the United States, basically, and be more of an enemy of the Soviets after that era. And so
another thing that while you're saying that is interesting is that Germany would actually, even though they went to war with the Soviet Union twice. But what's interesting is that they ended up sort of becoming reliant on them for many like energy, for instance. This happened later on, but they would convert. They started getting away from fossil fuels. They went towards natural gas, but guess what? Their main supplier ended up being the Russian Federation. So, ironically, Germany, France moves away from Russia, but Germany moves closer towards it.
Yeah. So ultimately, the Israelis did beat back the Arabs, but and a lot of them helped by supplies from the U.S. and other Western European countries. But ultimately, in retaliation of this, OPEC, which is the oil and petroleum, exporting countries, I think it's called. It's basically like a cartel of oil-producing countries. Obviously, didn't like that, so they imposed an oil embargo on a lot of these countries in the U.S. and Western Europe, and that, of course, as you can imagine, caused a ripple effect that plunged these countries into depression. I mean, at least for that point. I mean, it was later lifted a little later, but still the reverberating effects did happen in Western Europe. And it sort of was kind of a thing where the economic boom was sort of considered ended at that point. And this would later kind of relate into a lot of, the neoliberal policies that would later be adopted around the 80s in a lot of these European countries. But at least then, this was considered kind of like the big event that would end the sort of post-war boom in that era.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to end on is that heavy metal was invented in the early 70s, technically the late 60s, but I would say wager the early 70s is when it really hit its stride. And that's, I think, the best music genre. So that's how I would end on that. Also, I want to end on saying that commercial air travel also became normalized in Europe and all over the world in this period. So that's pretty cool too.
Yeah. Okay, so this was the 7th one in the series. It covered 1948 to 1973, and the next one will cover the second part of the Cold War from 1973 to 1991. But for now, that should cover most of the stuff we wanted to do.
Evan, before you go, we have 3 minutes left. I want to talk about what just happened today, which is Russia sort of invading Ukraine. I mean, it was a soft invasion. They were kind of invited in by Russian and allied regions of Ukraine, but I think I would consider that an invasion, if not in name, in all but name, right? What do you think is going to happen geopolitically? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I don't think it'll lead to a world war, but I mean, I think it'll ultimately be a crisis, probably bigger than the one in Crimea.
Do you think that there will be a regional war? I mean, there already is one, but do you think there'll be? No, I don't. But I consider that more of like a local war. I'm talking about. Do you think there'll be like European countries getting involved that didn't have, like Poland, for instance?
Yeah, Poland already is very worried about this.
But what do you think the chances are that Poland will actually have to send soldiers to die for?
Depends on what goes on. I mean, I can't predict the future, but I mean, I think that's ultimately it's going to be up to those nations to decide. I don't think the U.S. necessarily.
I'll tell you one thing. I'm really concerned now about Taiwan because Russia and China have a very strong alliance. I knew this for a long time. I'm sure you did too. But we're getting to see the fruit of it. It's bearing fruit in this ugly sort of communist, overblown way. But I also think there's something cool about it because those countries they have waited a long time for sort of the world to sort of give them respect. And America has been the number one country for too long, I think. I mean, just so many years now.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm happy to learn. I know a little bit of Mandarin, and I'm happy to learn some more Russian because I think those are great languages to have a lot of tradition, and it'd be very interesting to see where it takes me learning those languages.
That sounds good.
Oh yeah. You also expressed interest in wanting to learn Russian too.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm literally just stalling right now because we have 20 seconds. No, the podcast's still on, but we have 20 seconds left until the 1 hour mark. So I'm just trying to make sure we hit the 1 hour mark.
Wait. You said you cut it though, because we get that.
Oh, you're right. So it won't be an hour. Fine.
Yeah, you just cut out that last conversation.
All right. So it'll be like 57 minutes.
4 minutes.
57. Yeah. All right. I'll end it right now.